So Aurelia is an associate professor of Asian art history at Boston College. Her first book, What the Emperor Built, Architecture and Empire in the Early Ming, examines the building projects of the famous Yongle Emperor to consider how imperial ideology takes shape in built space. Her second book, In Death as in Life, A Material History of the Ming Dynasty Tombs, in progress, investigates the tombs of the Ming Dynasty elite from the perspectives of both architecture and material culture. She has engaged in several projects that help to shape the field of Chinese architecture history. This includes the compilation of 3 annotated state-of-the-field bibliographies for Oxford Bibliographies and involvement in a long-standing collaboration to create an English dictionary of traditional Chinese architectural terminology, which is really exciting. Please welcome, and joining Aurelia to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Simon. I want to first express my gratitude to Ping Fong for inviting me to give this lecture. I'm very honored to be here. And thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning to listen. Hopefully you'll learn some things and be stimulated by this material. So the title of my talk is Shrouded in Faith, Buddhist Burial Covers in Late Imperial China. Among the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century in China was a tomb unearthed from a site called Mawangdui near Changsha in Hunan province. The tomb, dated to 186 BC during the Han Dynasty, consisted of a large vertical pit, at the bottom of which were multiple layers of lacquered, nested wooden coffins. Above the innermost coffin layer, which contained the well-preserved corpse of the deceased, was a silk banner in excellent condition. The complex imagery painted on the banner has given rise to a number of different interpretations. Most scholars agree, however, that the central theme represents the soul of the deceased Lady Dai, that's the tomb occupant, ascending to the heavenly realm. So we see her. We see her depicted here. And this, by the way, is the earliest known portrait in Chinese painting. It is believed that the shroud was intended to help guide the deceased soul in its transition to the afterlife. And although Han texts allude to other such banners being used in funerary rites, this is the only example ever found. For more than 1,500 years after the Mawangdui funerary banner, burial shrouds do not seem to have been used in China. The next earliest known shroud does not date until around 1500 during the Ming Dynasty. The lack of material evidence in this long stretch of time may be due to the fragile materials, paper or silk, of the shrouds disintegrating over time. Or it might just be explained by the fact that burial shrouds did not become popular until much later. In any case, several burial shrouds from the Ming and Qing periods, that's roughly 1400 to 1900, have been unearthed from tombs in the last century, indicating that they were part of a much more widespread phenomenon. As we shall see, the later shrouds differ considerably in content from the Mawangdui banner, yet they still concern the deceased's transition into the afterlife. In Ming and Qing dynasty texts, the shrouds are called fa bei, or toluani jing bei. Fa bei, or Dharma cover, refers to the Buddhist teachings, Dharma, that cover the shrouds. And toluani jing bei means Dharani scripture cover. Dharani itself is a Sanskrit term that has been variously translated as incantation, spell, and magic formula into English. It refers to a Buddhist text linked with a specific deity that, when either spoken or written, was meant to help protect the devotee and generate positive outcomes for them. Texts describing the merits of Dharani can be found in the classical texts of all the major traditions of Buddhism, such as we can see from this excerpt from the Lotus Sutra, one of the most popular scriptures in East Asia. So I'm going to pause for a minute on this slide just to illustrate the relationship between Dharani, these incantations themselves, and then the scriptures that discuss Dharani. So I won't read the whole thing out loud here, but you can see that this is a chapter from chapter 26 from the Lotus Sutra. The chapter is called Dharani, and in it is a conversation between the Bodhisattva Medicine King, and he's having a conversation with the Buddha. And he starts by saying, "World-honored one, if there are good men or good women who can accept and uphold this Lotus Sutra, if they read and recite it, penetrate its meaning, or copy the sutra scrolls, how much merit will they gain?" And then the Buddha says, "If there are good men or good women who offer alms to the Buddha equal in number to the sands of 810,000 million, anyway, they were great, they will achieve great, great merit." And then, so I want to take some time to mention that these scriptures self-consciously say, copy me, recite me. So the scriptures, the scriptures themselves are ensuring their own longevity and also ensuring the spread of Buddhism by telling devotees that they will achieve great merits if they copy them. So this is very closely related to the material of the talk today. So the text goes on. The Bodhisattva Medicine King said to the Buddha, down here we are now, "World honor one, I will now give to those who preach the law Dharani spells, which will guard and protect them." He then pronounced these spells, "Anye manye mani mamane chite charite samye shim mitavi shante mukte muktatame." Okay, so it goes on and on. So you can see here that in this sutra, in this Buddhist scripture, the Dharani has been transliterated, or it's Dharani are usually either transliterated or just left in the original Sanskrit because their sound is more important than their meaning. So an equivalent for those of you unfamiliar with Dharani, the term Dharani and the concept Dharani might be the magic spell abracadabra. So that's meant to protect those who chant it. So Dharani are written on all but one of the known burial shrouds, so they are very important to the meaning and purpose of these shrouds. Well, due to a lack of surviving evidence, we will never be able to tell the complete story of Buddhist burial shrouds in Chinese history. But from the few examples that have come down to us, we are able to draw out some general characteristics. So although the imagery on the shrouds differ, they all combine depictions of Buddhist reliquaries, known as stupas or pagodas, with Buddhist writing, including Dharani and passages from sutras. Second, although these covers do not seem to have been used in Tibet proper, all but one of the shrouds incorporates Tibetan Buddhist imagery, such as you can see here. That's a stupa in the Tibetan style at the center of the image. The Yuan dynasty emperors, so the rulers of the Yuan dynasty in China, which lasted from 1279 to 1368, were Mongols, and they heavily supported Tibetan Buddhism. So this suggests that these Dharani covers may have originated in the Yuan dynasty, though no burial shrouds have ever been excavated from Yuan dynasty tombs. Nonetheless, the popularity of Tibetan Buddhist imagery on these burial shrouds suggests that they occurred in a post-Mongol material world. Another source of evidence for the fact that these burial shrouds are part of this post-Mongol culture in China is their material. So the later ones, the burial shrouds could either be printed on paper or woven out of silk, depending on the status of those who used them. So the medium of gold brocade, which we see in many of the later burial shrouds, is possibly a continuation of the Mongol practice of making so-called cloth in gold, an example of which you see here. So this is silk wrapped with gold wire, giving the impression that the whole cloth is made of gold. So again, whether or not this practice of using burial shrouds originated in the Yuan dynasty, many aspects of them can be traced to Mongol Yuan dynasty material culture. The elaborate combination of text and image in these burial shrouds makes them the most complex funerary artifacts of their respective tombs. They were potent power objects designed to continuously perform rituals for the dead, even in the absence of a human practitioner. As talismans, the shrouds also reveal a newfound level of attention being placed on the protection and preservation of the corpse inside these tombs. At the same time, the content of the inscriptions, which concerns longevity, salvation, and rebirth, among many other things, testify to the long-standing desire of Buddhist devotees to transcend this world and be reborn into a Buddhist heaven, thus escaping the suffering associated with the physical body within the tomb. Within all the examples discussed today, the imagery of the stupa plays an important role as the representation of the Dharma relic, or the embodiment of the teachings of the Buddha. The origins of the imagery on Buddhist burial shrouds can be traced to printed sheets combining images of deities and their dharani, which were meant to be worn on the body as amulets. This print from the year 920, for instance, depicts the Mahapratisara Bodhisattva surrounded by the incantation of wish fulfillment. At the bottom of the print is a citation from the Mahapratisara Dharani Sutra. The passage explains that those who copy the spirit incantation and carry it on their body will be rewarded with a host of benefits, including being kept in the minds of all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, being bestowed with bliss and security, being relieved of sickness, having disasters caused by past sins eliminated, and being protected and purified, secure, and blissful. At least 23 Mahapratisara amulets dating between the 8th and 11th centuries have been discovered in China. The act of printing, of course, facilitated the act of copying, which was why the print was the dominant medium for these amulets. This example from the 8th century, for instance, was kept in a small bronze box to be worn on the body. The earliest known use of these dharani sheets in a funerary context comes from a tomb in Sichuan province in the west of China. A small printed sheet bearing an image of an 8-armed Mahapratisara is surrounded by spiraling concentric layers of the incantation of wish fulfillment. This text was found tightly rolled and inserted into a silver bracelet worn on the right arm of the deceased, which we can see here. The amulet, worn so close to the body, was intended to protect the deceased and aid them in the transition to the afterlife. As early as the 9th century, dharani were also inscribed onto bronze and stone plaques and interred in tombs. A stone found in a 10th century tomb is described with the dharani of the victorious crown of the Buddha, Ushnisha Vijaya dharani, which is one of the most popular in China. Also 3 mantras, the mantra to dissolve hatred, the mantra for good rebirth, and a mantra to pacify the ground. A tomb in Liaoning in the northeast of China contained 14 stone slabs inscribed with dharani attached to the wall. A stone slab inscribed with 3 dharani, Sutra of Eliminating Sins, the mantra of rebirth in heaven, and the dharani of the Buddha of lamp knowledge who destroys hell, which promises salvation from hell to those who recite the dharani day and night for 3 weeks after death, was found in a tomb in Beijing. A bronze plaque incised with the dharani of the Buddha of lamp knowledge who destroys hell was also found in a Liao tomb in Liaoning province. So we can see that there's a trend of burying these dharanis in the tombs of Buddhist practitioners. Another possible prototype for the burial shrouds are wooden coffins inscribed with dharani and other scriptures. The coffins were unearthed from a tomb complex in Xuanhua, Hebei, that belonged to the Zhang family. The tombs date between 1093 and 1117 during the Liao dynasty. 4 of the 8 coffins excavated from these tombs are covered in the Heart Sutra, along with 18 different dharani written in Sanskrit with Chinese titles. The content of the scriptures mainly concerns saving the deceased from hell, being reborn in heaven, and attaining Buddhahood. On the upper edge of one of the coffins is an inscription in Chinese referring to it as a dharani coffin. These examples demonstrate that between approximately the 8th and 14th centuries, dharani were employed within the tombs of Buddhist practitioners. The major themes of the Dharani used within these burials include the confession and elimination of sins and a protection for a good rebirth. These elements are closely linked to funerary practices insofar as protection and good rebirth cannot be achieved without purification. And purification is based on the elimination of bad karma resulting from bad past actions. So as I just mentioned, the earliest known shroud in China was excavated from a tomb dating to the early 16th century in Guangxi County, Hubei province, which belonged to a lay Buddhist named Zhang Mao and his wife, surnamed He, who were buried together in 1520. The tomb consists of 2 brick chambers arranged side by side, and each containing a red lacquered coffin. The tomb architecture was well sealed with a mix of lime, sand, and juice, the juice of glutinous rice, a mixture known as sanhetu, which first started being used in the Ming Dynasty in China. This substance is very strong and apparently helped in the preservation of Zhang Mao's corpse, which was fully intact. More than 50 burial goods were unearthed from the coffin, Zhang Mao's coffin in particular, but almost nothing, including the body, survived from the burial of his wife. A mattress was placed. Here is his tomb epitaph, by the way. This describes his biography, and he was a celebrated kind of local hero because after a big drought and a big famine, he was instrumental in helping a lot of local people. So he was awarded with an official title, probably some sort of monetary award, and that is the reason why he was buried in such an elaborate manner as well. So a mattress was placed under Zhang Mao's corpse, and under this was a rush mat dyed a maroon color. He was wearing 7 layers of 9 pieces of silk and cotton clothing dyed in blues, whites, and yellows, and elaborate brocade. The overlarge sides of one of the robes indicates that it was specially designed for shrouding corpses. 9 silk gowns were also stuffed around the corpse. So it's a separate topic, but we can see from this tomb and other Ming Dynasty tombs how important clothing was in burials during this time. These sumptuous clothes, of course, were expensive, especially because he's just being buried with them. And so they clearly indicate his wealth and status during life. Interestingly, Zhang was also holding a money bag containing ashes. More than 10 sheets of paper money were also found in the money bag, in the robes of Zhang, and under the mattress. The money bag indicates that the deceased's belief in the so-called receiving life, which is also called the long life depository. Here's the picture here. This is based, in the words of Anna Seidel, on the concept of life as a financial loan which has to be repaid. So according to this popular belief, not so much Buddhist, more kind of popular religion, popular Buddhism. According to this belief, before they are born, human souls receive an advance payment from the underworld treasury, but must repay that loan during their life by burning paper money and reciting scriptures, among other religious activities. If not, the money will be lost. So material evidence of this belief system, including paper certificates, underworld money, and cloth purses with ashes, can be found in a number of other Ming Dynasty tombs. And many of you probably know that this practice is still carried out in many funerals today, the practice of burning paper money and other objects made from paper. So I just realized one of my slides is out of place. The corpse was covered in a blanket made of brown brocade, underneath which was the burial shroud. I like this image a lot because it's our only photograph in situ of the burial shroud being used, and it shows us that the burial shroud was not meant to cover the head, so shrouds were only covered the body from the neck down. So the burial shroud is printed on hemp paper in red ink, and it measures 1.62 meters long and 0.77 meters wide, so wide enough to cover the body. I've shown this image before of the whole shroud, but you can see it's very elaborate, very complex. There's a lot to kind of unpack and decode here. We can see 5 Tibetan-style stupas, each inscribed with a Lansta-style Sanskrit script seed syllable associated with one of the 5 Tathagatas, or 5 Buddhas, on the top section of the shroud. The base of the stupas are inscribed with the name of the Buddha and the direction with which it is associated. So in the north is Amoghasiddhi, in the west is Amitabha, in the center is Vairochana, etc., etc. So on either side of the stupas are verses associated with the 5 Tathagata. For instance, one of them says, the inscription to the right of Vairochana says, if one wants to fully understand all Buddhas in past, present, and future, he should contemplate the nature of the Dharma realm. All things are created by the mind alone. And then to the left and right of the 5 stupas are flowering trees and garlands, which you can make out here and here. Below the stupa imagery in the center of the shroud is a welcoming descent image. This is a common theme in the art of the Pure Land sect, which dates back at least to the Tang Dynasty, and Tang Dynasty lasted from 618 to 907 in China. At the center of the composition here is Amitabha Buddha flanked by 2 bodhisattvas. I'm not sure why this is not it. Okay, it's advancing slowly. So here we can see the central Buddha flanked by 2 bodhisattvas, and the 2 bodhisattvas hold a lotus base together in their hands, on the top of which is a small image of a man being blessed by Amitabha. So here, well, it's easier to see, much easier to see there. So the implication of this is the deceased, who is being escorted by Amitabha into the western paradise of ultimate bliss, the Pure Land over which Amitabha presided, and the most popular Pure Land in Chinese Buddhism. Above each of the bodhisattvas is a heavenly deity in a radiant cloud. The clouds, which come from the outside of the picture frame, combined with the 2 rays of light above the Buddha's head, indicate that the retinue has just arrived from the heavens. So this image would have aligned with the heart of the deceased within the casket, forming a connection between the shroud, this particular part of the shroud, and then his heart. So I have this image, this painting here as well. An article was just recently published on it, so it's somewhat new, or at least new to me, of Amitabha's retinue, a painting from the 1200s. So just to illustrate the fact that this iconography is very well entrenched in Buddhist art in China. So to get back to the shroud, the Buddha images are surrounded on 3 sides by the Ushnisha Vijayadharani sutra written in Sanskrit. One of the 3 sides of the Sanskrit on the 3 sides of the Sanskrit text are grids containing marks that look like fingerprints. This is a system of visual notation representing counting. And then specifically that Zhang Mao recited Amitabha's name, a practice known as Nianfuo, countless times during his lifetime. This notation system is similar to the Thousand Buddha motif, a kind of visual chant that is often depicted on the walls of Buddhist cave temples, either in painting or, as we see here, from the Longman caves, engraved. So it also calls to mind a rosary, and in this regard, the shroud functions as a document testifying to the deceased's sincere Buddhist practice during his lifetime. The lengthy inscription at the bottom of the shroud essentially concerns the Buddhist beliefs that life is impermanent and will eventually return to the Pure Land. It explains that if you want to eradicate the suffering of the 3 realms and be reborn in the Pure Land, you must arouse the enlightened mind and observe the 5 precepts. The final line of the inscription are worth noting for their intentions for the afterlife. So you can see it here, and I'll read it. All the evil karma I've created in the past are caused by beginningless greed, hatred, and ignorance. From body, speech, and mind, I now repent everything. May I be free from all obstacles when I am about to die. May I see the Buddha Amitabha, and I will be reborn in peace and joy. May this merit be used to adorn the Buddha and the pure people. Report 4 kinds of kindness and give aid 3 times. He who witnesses it all shows empathy. Do all this to repay the body and be reborn in the land of ultimate bliss. The 5 precepts are: first, no killing; second, no stealing; third, no sexual misconduct; fourth, no lying; fifth, no drinking alcohol or eating meat. So the combination of text and imagery on the shroud draws symbolism from both tantric, esoteric, or Tibetan, and also Pure Land Buddhism to help ensure a good rebirth for Zhang Mao. It also serves as a testament to his sincere faith during the afterlife. The large size of the image not only demonstrates the advanced level of printing technology in the middle of the Ming Dynasty, but also suggests a more widespread industry in which multiple copies of the same burial shroud were made. It is likely that these shrouds were printed from wood blocks at local monasteries and then purchased for the funerary rites. It's worth noting that nothing in particular on the shroud links it personally to Zhang Mao. So in other words, we don't have any inscriptions on this shroud that preserve his name, the time of his birth, or anything particular to him. So this suggests that these were part of generic funerary shrouds that could be bought at monasteries. Oh, I wanted to show this example, the stylistic, both of these are arranged in, the stylistic comparisons I think are obvious here. The compositions of them are similar, and then also this box at the bottom of the citation from the sutra itself is noteworthy. So our second example of a burial shroud comes from Zhejiang province. And in this example, text and image share a more intimate relationship. So this was a shroud excavated from the coffin of the wife of a man called Xiang Yuanbian, who was a local prominent local official. The tomb contained 3 brick chambers separated by walls, though the left-hand chamber was the only one that had survived intact upon the tomb's excavation. The chamber contained 3 coffins inscribed from left to right with the words main room, secondary room, and tertiary room, inside of which were all female corpses. The coffin labeled main room was the only coffin covered by a stone slab, and this was also where the majority of the burial goods were found, indicating that it belonged to the highest ranking of the 3 women buried. So the burial shroud is actually an ink rubbing on paper of the scriptural characters of the Diamond Sutra, organized in the form of a 7-story pagoda. It measures 184.5 centimeters long and 58 centimeters wide, or life size. 2 inscriptions on either side here indicate that this image was originally carved onto a now lost stone stele that was commissioned for the funeral of the deceased. On the lower right side is an inscription comprising 3 vertical lines, which were written by Xiang Mu, the son of Xiang Yuanbian, in the 27th year of the Wanli reign. And then on the left side of the rubbing is another inscription written by a certain Zhang Zhao. It explains that the sutra pagoda was composed by the holy monks, quote, the holy monks at Mount Wutai, a sacred mountain, Buddhist mountain in China's Shanxi province. And then, or some say, the Bodhisattva Manjushri himself composed this scripture. And the inscription goes on to say that upon seeing this sutra pagoda, all sentient beings will, for the first time, know the inconceivable merits of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So the inscription concludes with the name of the person that inscribed the stele, as well as a list of 6 people who donated to its creation, which included the friends and family members of Xiang Yuanbian and his wife. So the image that was inscribed on the stele and is now preserved in this rubbing only seems to be a much larger image that purportedly has its origins on Mount Wutai, and maybe even this, according to legend, this Bodhisattva Manjushri himself created the image. But we do know that the participation of so many people in the production of the stele indicates how costly it must have been. And then from these details in the inscriptions, we can also surmise that the stele was made for Xiang Mu's mother, the wife of Xiang Yuanbian, and it was over her coffin that the rubbing was placed. In its personalized inscriptions, this shroud, of course, differs from the one we just examined. The type of sutra pagoda depicted here is part of a tradition of creating images of pagodas from the words of scriptures that dates at least back to the Tang Dynasty. In the earliest examples, discovered in the Mogao caves in Dunhuang in far western China, the Heart Sutra is written in the form of an abstracted 5-story pagoda elevated on a high platform. The type of pagoda represented in the rubbing found in the Ming tombs belongs to a later type. So in this earlier type, which you're looking at on the screen here, you can see the original image here, and then this is image redrawn by a modern scholar that allows you to see how the sutra was read. So it would start here, and then you'd go here, and then here. Can't really trace the whole thing, but you can see that it's very clever, and it ultimately forms the shape of a 5-story pagoda. So in other words, this Dharma relic, or relic of the Buddha's teachings. The example we're looking at today is part of a later type, not this 5-story pagoda, but a later 7-story pagoda whose origins can be traced back to the Song Dynasty. So in sutra pagodas of this type, the Diamond Sutra takes the form of a 7-story pagoda topped by a spire with 2 chains extending to the uppermost eaves of the pagoda. In each of the 7 floors, except for the 4th floor, which contains a pagoda, is a Buddha image. So I kind of have to point this out here because it's a little bit hard to see. But do you see the Buddha image here, a Buddha image here? So those are repeated in all of the floors. But this one, and in the central floor, I guess it's the 4th floor, is a pagoda. Well, these images actually stand in for the words Buddha, for, and pagoda, ta, within the text. So instead of having the words there, whoever designed this put the images instead. They replaced these words with images. We also see within the large niche on the 1st floor, the Buddha represented, and he's preaching to his disciple Subhuti, the so-called one who first understands the emptiness. So we can see Subhuti is kneeling and listening attentively with his back turned to us. To the Buddha's left, the sutra begins with "Thus I have heard" here, and this is also the exact place where the sutra ends. So you'd start the whole sutra, it'd move all around in here, and then it ends up here. And actually, this lintel right here is, sorry, I lost my place here. So to the Buddha's left also the sutra ends saying, having heard this teaching of the Buddha, all experience great bliss. They believed, memorized, and practiced according to this diamond transcendent wisdom scripture. So this final line of this sutra, which I was just pointing out, diamond transcendent wisdom scripture, also acts as the title of the sutra, which is inscribed onto what looks like a lintel in the architecture of the pagoda above the Buddha. So the beginning and end of the sutra are thus continuous. So these are just a few of the examples of the high degree of ingenuity with which the text and image have been combined here. So this, of course, speaks to the cleverness of its original designer. As we can see here, the text is contained within a border that helps assist with legibility, though the readability of this text was never the intention of these kinds of written reliquaries. The burial shroud under consideration here differs from other sutra pagodas in at least 2 important ways. First, whereas these images were usually created with ink on paper, this version was engraved on stone and then transferred to a rubbing. Carving the individual letters with precision and then transferring the complex image into paper through the rubbing successfully required much different skills than writing with a brush and ink, though they can still be considered acts of copying that would accrue merit in the Buddhist sense. Second is the funerary context of the sutra pagoda. The stele was made for the funeral and the rubbing was made for the burial. Thus, this artifact did not have an audience in the traditional sense of someone who could appreciate the cleverness of the design or engage in the performativity of the viewing experience. So what was it doing there? Well, According to Susan Huang, miracle tales invoking the Diamond Sutra were popular between the Song and Ming periods, center on the efficacy of the sutra in prolonging life and helping to rescue devotees from the underworld. In the illustrations accompanying these tales, we can see protagonists visiting the underworld courts only to be later sent back to the human world on account of their deeds of reciting and venerating the Diamond Sutra during their lifetimes. So the Diamond Sutra was often referred to as the sutra for prolonging life, which reflected the popular understanding that it had the power to extend one's life. So these popular understandings of the Diamond Sutra were likely what led to this selection of the particular sutra pagoda for the funeral and burial in the Xiang family tombs. The coffin atop which the burial shroud lid was placed also contained an illustrated volume, which you're looking at here, of the Pure Land Sutra with the Amitabha triad on the cover. This, of course, denotes the Buddhist faith of the deceased and her wishes to be reborn in the Pure Land. So the powerful combination of these two sacred texts thus helps function to ensure that the deceased has a good afterlife, and specifically one in which she could be saved from hell and reborn in heaven. Now, our last examples all date to the Qing dynasty. So the last dynasty in China, which lasted from approximately 1644 to 1911. Several shrouds with Tibetan Buddhist content have been found within the tombs of the Qing dynasty Manchu emperors and the social elite associated with them. So these shrouds reveal the emergence of a third shroud typology, at least by the early 19th century, which became the dominant form of burial shroud from that point onwards. Qing court records have several references to these burial shrouds. So, for instance, one of them explains that, quote, a minister of this dynasty was specially given a Dharani Sutra cover. The cover was made of white hempen thread and a gold lettered Tibetan sutra was inscribed on it. Those who receive the shrouds are favored. Another Qing dynasty text records a Dharani Sutra granted to the Tibetan Lama Hutu Kutu. This was made of local, quote, it was made of local silk and satin. At the top was the Great Compassion Dharani, written in Sanskrit letters forming a large circle, and the words were all rotating from the middle to the outside. It was about 10 layers and was very fine, like hairs on the body, yet clear enough to be counted. So who's ever writing this text was clearly struck by how well crafted all the letters on this burial shroud were. So we have one more text which is very valuable because it records information on the placement of the burial shroud within the tomb. The text describes the burial of a concubine of the Daoguang emperor who was interred in the 14th year of his reign, or 1834. The innermost coffin, as the text explains, was made of nanmu wood, the most important type of kind of imperial wood in China. And it was adorned with 35 layers of bright yellow lacquer. It was then painted with golden dragons and written with Tibetan characters. The burial shroud was draped over the coffin. So this is useful because it tells us that these shrouds, like the previous example we just saw, were not draped over the body, but rather the innermost coffin of the tomb. And this is important, especially because, to my knowledge, none of any archaeological report I've read on the excavations of these tombs describes where the shroud was found within the tomb. So this is our only piece of textual evidence for that bit of information. The reason I'm not showing you images of these burial shrouds is because we don't have any. We just have the texts that refer to them, or at least for the ones I just explained. So the earliest known of these shrouds can be dated with some accuracy, came from a tomb in the Mongolian autonomous county in Liaoning province. It was discovered in 1967, and the tomb belonged to a Mongolian prince named Dampa Dorje, who died in the 18th year of the Jiaqing reign, or 1814. Dampa Dorje and his father-in-law, Zala Feng A, had both served in the Jiaqing court and were close with the emperor. A stele erected in front of his tomb bears an inscription in Manchu, Han, and Mongolian that describes Dampa Dorje's meritorious service to the Jiaqing Emperor from a young age. Textual records show that the Jiaqing Emperor also gave a Dharani cover to Dampa Dorje's father while he was still alive. So this shows that while sutra covers were usually granted upon death, on some occasions they could also be bestowed during life as rewards. So this burial shroud, which this is the only image I've been able to see of it, unfortunately, it's in black and white and not very clear. But it's 2.45 meters long and 1.46 meters wide and woven with red and gold thread on yellow silk. We can see at the center of the cover is a Tibetan stupa, inside of which are dharani, written in Longstanding script. Surrounding the stupa are square and circular cartouches containing Sanskrit and Chinese texts. The cartouches explains that if the dharani shroud is used to cover the deceased, they can be reborn in the Western Pure Land. Even those, it claims in this text here, even those who have committed serious sins and cannot be reborn in the Western Pure Land after this death can still be reborn in the human world and then in heaven with it if they use this sutra cover. And then if they continue to practice good deeds, they can finally be reborn in the Pure Land. So this passage is clearly describing reincarnation. Instructions for how to place the shroud on the body are also woven into the cover. So we see the words, they're impossible to make out here, but take my word for it because they exist in other covers. We see the words between the navel, left knee, right knee, left sole, right sole, etc., woven into the cover, indicating where it should be placed. A second shroud of this type is dated to the first year of the Xuantong period in 1906 by an ink inscription on the rear of the quilt. Despite being produced more than a century after Dampa Dorje's shroud, the imagery is identical. Another inscription on the back of the shroud notes that it was created in a workshop in Suzhou, which is in southeastern China, and it's the location of the imperial textile workshops. So the skilled most craftsmen worked in these workshops creating goods for the Qing imperial family. The consistency among these two Qing burial shrouds leaves no question that they were produced in the same workshop. So indeed, little variation can be detected among the shrouds, the Qing dynasty shrouds, in terms of their imagery, which suggests that by this time a standard burial shroud program had emerged. The main difference occurs in the threads used for weaving, which appeared to have differed considerably. The Xuantong example that we were just looking at appears to be, again, this image isn't great and this is all I have, but it appears to be red on yellow silk. Then we have this example I showed at the beginning of the talk, which is gold on bright red silk from 1875, now in a museum in Australia. And then this shroud, this is my own photo. I was able to see this last week in a small museum of Tibetan art on Staten Island in New York. So I apologize for the quality of the image, but I think it probably allows you to see how much it looks like gold. And just in some of these details, you can just, I think it's even hard to imagine how this was made on looms, weaving silk threads together, and to get this level of precision in all the words and descriptions and the imagery is just, to me, absolutely mind-boggling. So in this museum collection, there's supposedly another shroud, which I wasn't able to see. The director couldn't locate it, which has been described as blue-black in color in an exhibition catalog from several years ago. So while this is on the screen, I guess I'll just mention that this was bought, the provenance is unknown, don't know whose tomb this came from, how it got to the collection of Jacques Marchais, a kind of eccentric woman who collected a lot of Tibetan art in the early 20th century. But things like this, I'm sure, are not allowed out of China anymore. This is just too high quality, and the fact that it's associated with members of the imperial family means that most objects like this stay in China, and you can't have access to them. Generally speaking, they're very difficult to see. Okay, so gold, red, and yellow are, of course, imperial colors. So their usage reinforces the connection of the Qing imperial family and suggests that these shrouds are not just religious, but also political artifacts in that they testify to the status of the individual in relation to the Qing emperor who would have gifted them. So, in conclusion, the historian Timothy Brooke has observed in Ming Dynasty texts that while Confucian vocabularies for death describe it in terms of final ending, decomposition, departure, and loss, Buddhist texts from the same time explain death in terms of awakening, returning, and going on. So therefore, Buddhism offered individuals a much more hopeful picture of the postmortem life. And indeed, as we have seen here, salvation was a key issue in these burial shrouds. The burial shrouds potently combine scriptures and images associated with the true teachings of the Buddha to help the deceased transcend this world and be reborn into the Pure Land heavens. They are not only passive records of the deceased's sincere practice of Buddhism during their life, but also active in the sense that they protect the body apotropaically and perform the act of copying and repeating the sutra on behalf of the deceased as they transition into the afterlife. In the long stretch of human history, the Qing dynasty is much closer to our own time than the Ma Wangdui banner that opened this talk. It might therefore be unsurprising to hear that the types of funerary shrouds in use during the last few centuries of imperial rule in China are in fact still being used today. Known as future life covers, these shrouds are made in synthetic fabric, so rayon and other kinds of materials, not silk anymore, sateen. And they're mass produced and they're easily bought at temples or even online, particularly in Taiwan. As we can see, however, they are nearly identical in imagery to the imperial shrouds of the Qing dynasty, attesting to the longevity and power of this particular combination of images and texts. Moreover, they are used in much the same way. They are to be draped over the body before being cremated or interred in the ground, and then they're also sometimes used as talismans to protect the worshiper in life. All right, so I will end there, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thanks for listening.
Hi, yes. Do you have any clue about the printing processes used for the earliest shrouds?
No, I haven't found any information on it. I mean, I can guess. So the reason I said the wood blocks, they were printed from wood blocks, and the large wood blocks were stored at monasteries, is because Buddhist monasteries in China, since a long time ago, served as printing presses of scriptures. So still today, a lot of monasteries hold really important wood blocks of Buddhist scriptures. So I assume that they also started manufacturing these shrouds. They're so big, though, the blocks would have had to be so big themselves that I don't think a single block was used. It seems like probably multiple blocks were used. But that would, it requires further investigation. There are also parts like those kind of fingerprint notations I was noting that seem not printed, but maybe added afterwards or painted in or something. So it could have been a process that involved both printing and maybe adding some elements, hand painting.
I guess I have the mic, so I go next.
Okay.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. I was sort of intrigued by your comment on how the shrouds were placed below the neck in this culture. And then one hears or learns about Aboriginal or other cultures where the shrouds are predominantly just on the face and not on the body. And I wondered, is there any reason for this sort of difference?
I just don't know. I mean, that one photograph we have just made me think about it, or I was, just wondering why isn't the face covered? There's nothing as far as I've encountered in the scriptures, that says how you're supposed to use these burial shrouds, or how they're supposed to be laid on the body. Our closest indication is the parts of these burial shrouds that say right knee, left knee, but these ones were placed on the coffin, so it's a little confusing. I'm afraid I don't know, but it's just a good question to think about, why the head only from the neck down. I mean, the heart, this area was the most important, so I guess that was considered the most worthy of protecting.
Yes, at the beginning you seem to imply, is it the case that the Vajrayana came to China from Tibet? Or did it come, was it also, I mean, are the images Tibetan images? Because there wasn't the Vajrayana already in China from other sources?
So maybe that was a little confusing. So the earliest images I showed of the Dharani amulets were, as early as the 8th century, dated through like the 8th and 11th centuries. Those have even though they have what might be described as esoteric Buddhist content or Vajrayana content, the imagery itself is not so Tibetan Buddhist in style. What I'm really concentrating on when I'm thinking of these shrouds as a kind of post-Mongol phenomenon is particularly the shape of this stupa here. So this is, I didn't mention this in my talk, but the Mongol rulers, specifically the first emperor of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, Kublai Khan, built several pagodas like this, or stupas in the Tibetan style, and his successors built several of them too. So from that point onwards, large stupas in the Tibetan style would have been visible to people in the capital, and we see within the Ming and Qing dynasties this imagery becoming popular in the visual culture produced at the court. And I'm struck by the fact that, I guess I won't go back because it's too far, but the burial shroud belonging to Zhang Mao, the lay Buddhist, Han lay Buddhist, also had Tibetan Buddhist style stupas. Yeah, the Dharani is in this stupa. It's Sanskrit, but some of them have Tibetan as well. These were also found in Mongolia, in the Qing dynasty, printed versions of these.
The Tibetan Buddhist monk, why does it have Chinese instead of Tibetan?
Because he lived in China, I'm guessing. I mean, where are we? You're talking about, the Dampa George, are you talking about? I don't know. Just in the, after the Yuan dynasty, it was common to use multilingual texts in a Buddhist context. I mean, we see this, if anybody's familiar with the Juyong Stupa north of Beijing, inscriptions in many different scripts are preserved, basically all different scripts associated with the Buddhist world. In the Ming Dynasty on imperial steles, we have Tibetan, Sanskrit, and Chinese. So, and then once the Qing started ruling, we had Manchu to this. So these are very, I guess, linguistically complicated, and they preserve a lot of different, So I'm not sure if I answered your question directly, but yes. We see multiple scripts on these.
I've been kind of wondering about the strange arrangement in that pagoda inscription where you sort of have to make your way through the puzzle.
Yeah.
It would seem to me that part of the objective of these mantras, etc., must be to calm the mind. And if you have to focus on tracking something complex, the wandering of thoughts in the mind may be suppressed. So this may not just be a clever demonstration, but it may have a purpose.
So you're suggesting that maybe they were intended to be read carefully, and the trickiness of them helped focus. Yeah. Well, this is the only, well, there's an example in Korea as well. This is, by the way, part of a much larger East Asian practice. But this is the only known example or the only example in China that I know of which was used in a funerary context. But yeah, most of them were made for life, and that kind of performativity or playfulness or cleverness, I think, was certainly part of it. But I like your interpretation. That may have helped focus the thoughts, trying to read this all in a continuous manner.
Thank you. That actually made me think of a labyrinth. So I guess this is more of an exploratory question rather than a concrete one. So there was something you mentioned before about pacifying the land, I believe you had said early
yes,
on.
that's written in one of the inscriptions.
Yeah, and it made me think about early Tibet and the concept of the Nagas. And so, especially more like in the bone tradition, which was prior to Buddhism, and the interaction between, is it Tantric and Nyingma Buddhism and the bone tradition. And so I guess it made me wonder, can you just speak anything about the more, the influence or the interplay between the earlier faiths and connection to the five elements rather than, I don't know. Like I said, it's an exploratory question, not really a concrete one. Thank you.
Probably answering your specific question is beyond my capabilities right now, but your reference to that particular part of the sutra that talks about consecrating the ground is, of course, I mean, it's not specific to Buddhism either. My main focus, as Simon announced at the beginning of this talk, is Chinese architecture. And of course, before building anything above ground or anything above ground, you had to prepare the space. I mean, this is something that goes back to India and Tibet as well. So any kind of sacred architecture, the ground must be consecrated and prepared in a...
The spirits, the Nagas, in particular, like in the early faiths of Tibet, particularly, like you have to really, before you dig, so to speak, you have to also
not to disturb the
Nagas, right? Because they also bring
bad fortune. In the Chinese context, I mean, this is all part of feng shui practices, part of making sure either what's built underground or above ground brings the greatest number of blessings to the person using the tomb. I mentioned in my talk, and I wonder if anybody was curious about why the body of the deceased would need to be protected after it was already dead. And clearly, the corpse would need to be protected after it was already, the person was already deceased. But there was a huge practice of tomb robbery in China. So it seems like there was definitely and the tomb architecture itself, which I didn't describe so much, but in the Ming Dynasty became very secure, in the Yuan Dynasty, we have big open-chambered tombs where the body was very exposed, but in the Ming Dynasty, there was really this sense that you had to protect the body, both through, it seems like, these rituals and burial shrouds in the cases of the Buddhists buried in them, but also in terms of the coffin and tomb structure itself. So there was this really huge kind of newfound focus in the post-Mongol period of really protecting the corpse and protecting the tomb and everything inside it. So there were actual, not just supernatural threats, but actual threats in terms of grave robbers and people who might disturb the tombs.
I have the mic back here.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for an amazing presentation. Thanks. And I'm glad we are on to the topic of architecture. I'm an architectural historian, very intrigued, like the previous question, on the relationship between the sutras, the text of the sutra, and the production of architectural form. And I'm wondering, how you read that, And it reminds me that the oldest stupas, Ashoka's stupas, even 3rd century BC, also had sutras basically creating the toranas and the gateways in the front, which suggests to me that, particularly Buddhist architecture is simply, has a transparent relationship between text and architecture, which is that they are the same.
Yes.
Would that be a reasonable interpretation in this case as well?
Yes, and it's something that's very complicated. Really good point. I mean, of course, in the Ashokan stupas, we don't have inscriptions really, but of course there's stories from Jataka tales and, the biography of the Buddha's life and that kind of thing. So that's I'll remember that and try to add it in here. But there are many things that I wanted to mention in this talk, but cut out for time. But the association between pagodas, relics, texts, sutras and dharani, and there's also a type of architecture called dharani pillars, and in which the dharani were inscribed onto physical pillars and put outside graves, and the texts tell us that the shadow cast by the sun would help protect the grave. So all of this is very overlapping, or the distinctions between all of these things are very overlapping and very complex. And in crypts, in the underground chambers of pagodas, we also find dharani pillars. We also find these texts. Of course, deposits of in India, Tibet, Central Asia, China, in the deposits of stupas, we also see Dharma relics. We also see scriptures, serving as relics, and serving as this kind of embodiment of the Buddhist teaching or Dharma relic that I mentioned. So the associations between all of them is very complex. Indeed.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think you're pointing, I remember that. So what I'm hearing you say is that all these separate realms, from textile to text to painting to architecture to body to clothing to relics, these are not seen as distinct entities, but rather one continuous embodiment.
Correct.
I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. And then, what's intrigued me, this is all very preliminary research, and your questions are really stimulating a lot, so thank you all for them. But these burial shrouds, I want to convey, if I didn't in my talk, that they're very rare. They would have been part of a more widespread practice probably, but I've looked at many Ming tombs, and there are only 2 I know of that use these burial shrouds out of hundreds that have been excavated. So it's not like everybody was using these, even though I'm sure more people than what we've discovered were. They were part of this kind of, very, I think, devout practitioners only would be interested in these. And this is a category of object that emerged quite late in Chinese history, only, as I kept kind of suggesting, in this post-Mongol period, and various aspects of their imagery and productions suggest that.
Okay, here's one over here. Oh, hold on one second, sorry. Just one second.
Thank you. Going back to the point you made just prior to this last question, made me think the wife, He, of Zhang Mao, you said that her body was missing. Was her body stolen, or?
No, it just probably decomposed. I'm not sure, because it seems like their 2 coffins were made in the same way. They both had these lacquer coffins. I'm not sure, and surrounded by this sanhutu, this mix of glutinous rice and other things. I don't know why his was preserved and hers wasn't, but I think it decomposed rather than being stolen. But yeah, graves were robbed all the time in Chinese history. The fact that we even have anything this precious left is kind of miraculous. Yeah.
One of your earlier pictures with the one you're talking about right now, that particular grave, it's very, very far down. That hole
my very first one?
That hole was very deep.
Yeah.
Do we have any sense of why they knew to excavate there, And secondly, what was the original depth? You know, there is a certain amount of increase in the soil level.
Yeah.
Do we have any sense of how far below the surface of the ground it was originally at the time it was excavated?
Oh, these are all hard questions. No. I guess what comes to mind, I mean, I don't know the answer. You know, that first tomb I showed was from 186 BC, so you're right that it looks much deeper because, you know, the soil's been built up over thousands of years. How that particular tomb was discovered, most tombs in China, including the famous terracotta soldiers, were discovered by chance. And most of the stuff I talked about today was the tomb. Almost everything, as far as I know, was discovered by chance. We do know where, for instance, the tombs of the Ming and Qing rulers were. Several Qing dynasty tombs have been excavated, but only one of the tombs of the Ming emperors has been excavated. And I was going to talk about it here, but again, didn't have time, and there was fragments of a burial shroud within that on one of his concubines. The Yongle emperor was buried with 2 concubines. The problem is this was excavated in the 60s or 70s, and there's a huge fat excavation report, but it was done so badly that like everything disintegrated. It's all gone now. So even like the fragments of the burial shroud, which describe it as printed on red ink, it's gone. We only know from that original excavation report. So even though like imperial tombs, we know where they are, we know there's probably great stuff within them, I'm dying for them all to be excavated. I don't know if that's going to be done in my lifetime. And then these small tombs from which the things I discussed today were excavated, there's so much construction in China, stuff is being unearthed all the time, but it's not done in any systematic way that allows me to get a comprehensive picture of like how many burial shrouds actually existed in China, how widespread was this practice, was it concentrated in certain localities or was it all over the place? You know, these kinds of questions that I would love to know answers to are just impossible to make conclusions about just because it's so random what's been excavated. So that's, yeah, what came to mind with your question. Most tombs are discovered by chance as, you know, new freeways and subways and things are being built.
Well, I just want to thank Aurelia Campbell again for an amazing presentation. And